You stand in the heart of a Tudor marketplace, the cold wind cutting through your skin, the stench of unwashed bodies, ale, and burning pitch heavy in the air. Around you, a sea of faces presses closer, their breath rising in white clouds, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that is not for food, but for blood. Wooden beams creak beneath the weight of a scaffold, towering above the crowd, like an altar. The sound of boots striking timber echoes as the executioner climbs the steps, his face shadowed, his hands steady. In his grip, a blade glints, a perfect arc of steel, polished until it blinds you when it catches the pale winter sun. The crowd jeers, laughs, spits. Children perch on shoulders, eager to witness what their parents call justice. Vendors sell roasted nuts beside them, as if this moment were nothing more than sport. You feel the tension ripple through the mob, a strange mix of celebration and cruelty, of carnival and funeral. The condemned kneels, bound and trembling, their breath shallow, their lips moving in silent prayer. Their words are lost, drowned beneath the roar of anticipation. And then comes silence. A silence so sudden, so absolute, it thrums in your ears like a drum. You can hear the creak of rope, the rustle of cloth, the quickened pace of your own heartbeat. Time slows as the axe is lifted high, as the figure bows their head, as the crowd leans forward as one. The moment stretches, unbearably sharp, until steel meets flesh in a single merciless stroke. A cheer erupts, savage and thunderous, as though victory itself had been won. This is not punishment in the way you understand it. This is theater, grand, grotesque, and inescapable. A stage where power is written in blood, where loyalty is demanded at the edge of a blade, where death itself is turned into a lesson for the living. You do not leave untouched. No one does. This is Tudor Britain, a kingdom where fear ruled as surely as crown and scepter, where kings and queens wielded terror to bind their subjects, and where the law was less about justice than it was about control. From 1485 to 1603, this world of spectacle and severity shaped the lives of all who dared to breathe beneath the Tudor throne. And today, you are about to walk its streets, stand in its courts, and witness its punishments. Strange, savage, and unforgettable. Today, on Cave Tales Ancient History, we reveal the bizarre and severe methods the Tudors used to keep their world in line. The silence after an execution never lasted long in Tudor Britain. The crowd might gasp, cross themselves, or cry out in horror, but soon the spectacle would continue, for the monarchy demanded more than obedience. It demanded fear, stamped into flesh and bone. Nothing was considered more dangerous than treason, for to betray the crown was to betray the body of England itself. And so, the punishment had to be more than death. It had to be destruction. You find yourself drawn toward a different stage, a place reserved for traitors. Here, the scaffold is not built for a clean stroke of the axe. Instead, it is a theater of torment, designed to unmake a person in front of all who dared to watch. The condemned man is dragged through the streets, tied to a wooden hurdle, his body scraping against stone and mud, while the mob howls with approval. Horses strain against their harnesses as the traitor is pulled toward the place of execution. A parade of ruin meant to grind his dignity into the ground before the blade ever touches him. At the gallows, the ritual begins. First comes the hanging, not to death, but to the edge of it. You can see the man's face turn purple, his legs kicking against the air as the noose tightens, his lungs burning, his body thrashing. And just when mercy seems a breath away, the rope is cut. He falls, gasping, alive but broken. Then the true cruelty begins. Knives are drawn. His belly is opened before your eyes, his entrails pulled out and flung into the fire as the crowd shrieks and presses closer. His chest is cut open, his heart lifted high, still trembling, before it too is cast aside. What remains of him is quartered, his limbs severed, his head hacked from his shoulders. Pieces of his body are scattered to the corners of the realm, nailed to gates and displayed on walls. If the traitor was noble, the scene was more refined, yet no less chilling. The execution ground becomes a stage draped in ceremony. Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, kneels in silence on a French sword block, her lips whispering final prayers. The air holds steady as the executioner raises not an axe, but a sword. One swift strike, clean and precise, and the Queen's head tumbles into straw. Thomas More, famed for his conscience, mounts the scaffold with calm defiance, only to meet the same fate. Their deaths are framed as acts of justice, but their afterlives belong to the crowd. For even the highest bloodline could not escape the steel edge of Tudor power. Travel now across the Thames, and you see the bridge that binds the city together. London Bridge is no ordinary crossing. It is a gallery of death, its gates crowned with decaying heads, blackened by sun and shriveled by wind. The faces are barely human, mouths gaping in eternal screams, eyes hollowed into darkness. These grisly trophies whisper their warning to every passer-by. Defy the crown, and you too will become part of this grotesque architecture. The bridge is not simply stone and wood. It is a graveyard suspended over water, a message carved into the very skyline of the city. This is how the Tudors ruled. They understood that terror lingered longer than mercy, that a severed head could speak louder than the living voice it once held. Treason was not just punished. It was erased, dismantled, transformed into a warning that outlived the traitor himself. If the Tudors could execute their own queens for disloyalty, imagine what they'd think of someone watching Cave Tales' ancient history, but refusing to subscribe. If that's you, at least confess in the comments why you won't support history. Faith in Tudor Britain was not merely belief. It was law, carved into every breath you took and every word you spoke. The church was not only a sanctuary, but a court, its judgment as binding as the king's. And in this world, doubt was not a private thought. It was a crime. To question the scriptures, to stray from the sanctioned path, was heresy. And heresy was not punished quietly. It was burned into memory with fire. You stand among the crowd again, pressed against the wooden barriers that encircle the marketplace. Before you rises a stake, thick and splintered, bound with chains. At its base lies a heap of brushwood, tar-soaked and piled high. A man is led forward, his hands bound, his face pale but defiant. The priest demands his recantation, but he shakes his head. The sentence has already been written. The executioner binds him to the post, wrapping the chain tight around his chest, pressing the iron links into his skin. The air fills with the acrid smell of pitch. A torch touches the wood, and the fire answers with a roar. Smoke billows, thick and choking. The condemned man coughs, gasps, cries out, but the flames consume his words. His body twists against the chain, his flesh blackening, his cries breaking into silence. The crowd watches, some crossing themselves in horror, others staring wide-eyed, transfixed by the spectacle. The fire devours not only the man, but the possibility of dissent. His ashes scatter, carried into the sky as both a warning and a sermon. Yet heresy was not the only sin dragged into the open. In the Tudor courts, private life was never private. A whispered curse against God, a word spoken in anger, could condemn you to the stocks, your head and hands locked in wood, while neighbors hurled mud, rotten food, even stones. For those who broke the laws of marriage, adultery, fornication, the punishment was flesh on flesh. A whip cracked across the back, each lash tearing skin, each cry echoing across the square. Sometimes hot irons pressed against the body, branding shame into the skin, leaving scars that spoke louder than any confession. Even the simplest acts of rebellion, an oath taken in vain, a careless remark against the church, could cost you dearly. A coin ripped from your hand, a fine that starved your family, a punishment meant to remind you that your soul was never your own. The puritanical grip reached into every household, every bedroom, every whisper between friends. Your thoughts were measured, your body policed, your spirit shackled. This was control not only through law, but through conscience. The Tudors ensured that guilt followed you like a shadow, that sin was written not just on your soul but on your body. And when the lash marks faded, the memory remained, a scar inside your mind, a reminder that nothing, not even silence, could protect you. They branded people just for sins. I only ask you to subscribe. If that feels too heavy, then unburden yourself in the comments and tell us why you'd rather carry the guilt. Not every punishment in Tudor Britain ended in fire or blood. Some were crafted not to kill, but to humiliate, to strip a person of dignity until their very name became a curse in the mouths of their neighbors. In these moments, punishment was theater of shame, played out in streets and marketplaces, where the condemned were not just punished by law, but mocked by their own community. You picture the drunkard first. The law had little patience for those who stumbled home after too much ale. To drink was common. To be drunk in public was a disgrace. And so, the offender was forced into the drunkard's cloak, a heavy wooden barrel hollowed out with holes for the arms, legs, and head. The man staggers under its weight, the rim of the cask biting into his shoulders. The crowd laughs, jeering as he stumbles forward, unable to hide, his shame made into spectacle. Each step rattles like a drum, each fall greeted with cruel laughter. He is not merely punished, he is turned into a walking joke, his body the punchline of the state. But humiliation was not reserved for men. Women who spoke too freely, who gossiped, who scolded their husbands, were punished with a cruelty uniquely tailored to silence them. The scold's bridle, a cage of iron, was locked around the head. A bar of metal, sharpened or spiked, was forced into the mouth, pressing against the tongue. You can see her eyes, wide with terror, as the device clamps shut. Her lips bleed where the iron bites. Her jaw aches under its weight. She cannot speak, cannot cry out. Only watch as her neighbors smirk, as her own words are turned into the very chains that bind her. For hours, sometimes days, she wears this mask of silence until her spirit bends under the weight of humiliation. Then there is the river. You see a wooden stool on long beams, set at the water's edge. Women accused of nagging, of unruliness, of witchcraft, are strapped to the seat. With a heave, the beam is lowered, plunging them headfirst into the cold, dark water. The river closes over them, muffling their screams, filling their lungs with icy blackness. The crowd counts the seconds, 10, 15, 20, before the stool jerks upward again, dragging the woman gasping into the air. Her hair clings to her face, her eyes wide with terror, her chest heaving. And then, with merciless rhythm, she is plunged again, the water swallowing her cries. This dunking continues until she is broken. Whether or not guilt is proven, shame is certain. Humiliation was a punishment more insidious than death. It lingered long after the crowd dispersed, long after the bruises healed. A scar on reputation, a stain on memory. You could survive the stocks, the bridle, the stool, but the laughter, the whispers, the mocking glances followed you for the rest of your life. In Tudor Britain, survival was not freedom. It was living with the shadow of shame. The Tudors forced people into barrels and cages just to make crowds laugh. I won't do that. I'll only ask you to subscribe to Cave Tales Ancient History. If you won't, then tell us in the comments why humiliation is better than hitting a button. Not all punishments in Tudor Britain drew blood. Some carved deeper wounds without spilling a drop. These were punishments of ridicule, where the sentence was not death, but shame. Shame so heavy it could cling to a person for life. To the Tudors, humiliation was a weapon, a way of turning human suffering into public theater. The drunkard's cloak was one such punishment. You see it now. A man, staggering beneath the weight of a great wooden barrel, hollowed through with holes for his head, arms, and legs. The cask presses down on him, making each movement awkward, each step unsteady. Children point and laugh, women jeer, men mock him as he stumbles through the streets. The sound of his footsteps echoes like hollow drumbeats, each thud announcing his disgrace. He is no longer a man, but a walking warning, a joke in the eyes of his neighbors. And yet, beneath the laughter lies a darker truth. The cloak was meant to crush the spirit more than the body, to brand the soul with shame. For women, the punishments cut even deeper. Gossip, nagging, or simply speaking too freely could draw the wrath of husband, neighbor, or court. The scold's bridle was their answer, a contraption of iron fitted over the head, clamping the jaw, pressing a cruel piece of metal into the mouth. You can see her eyes, wide with humiliation, as the iron presses against her tongue, silencing her voice. She cannot cry out. Her words are trapped behind bloodied lips. She is paraded through the streets, a living spectacle of obedience, enforced by steel. The weight of the bridle is not only physical, it is a message, telling every woman who sees it what happens when her tongue dares to speak against order. And then, there is the river. At the water's edge stands the ducking stool, a long wooden beam with a chair at its end. A woman accused of witchcraft, or simply of being troublesome, is bound to the seat. The crowd surges forward, eager for the show, as the beam tips. She plunges beneath the surface, the icy water swallowing her whole. The seconds stretch, 10, 15, 20, before she is heaved sputtering back into the air. Her lungs strain for breath, her hair plastered across her face. But there is no mercy. The stool dips again, dragging her into the darkness below. Each plunge erases her dignity. Each gasp is met with mocking laughter. It does not matter whether she is guilty. The ritual ensures she is broken, body and spirit alike. Public humiliation in Tudor Britain was more than punishment. It was spectacle designed to leave scars that no physician could heal. These punishments were meant to remind the condemned that survival was not escape, because even when the instruments of iron were removed, the memory clung to them like a second skin. To live on after such shame was to live haunted. The Tudors forced people into barrels and cages just to make crowds laugh. I won't do that. I'll just ask you to subscribe to Cave Tales Ancient History. If you won't, tell us in the comments why humiliation is better than hitting a button. In Tudor Britain, even hunger could be a crime. Poverty was not seen as misfortune, but as weakness, a threat to order, a disease that had to be stamped out before it spread. And so, the poor were punished not with compassion, but with cruelty, their desperation twisted into spectacle for the crowd. You picture the thief first. A boy, perhaps no older than 12, caught with a crust of bread tucked beneath his coat. His eyes are wide, his ribs sharp beneath his skin. But the law has no room for pity. He is dragged into the square, where the sentence is swift. A knife flashes, and in a single moment his ear is sliced from his head, the wound raw and bleeding as the crowd cheers. The pain is sharp, but sharper still is the knowledge that everyone can now see his shame. The missing ear marks him forever as a thief, a living reminder of crime branded into his very flesh. Others lose more. A hand chopped clean at the wrist, the stump wrapped in rough cloth, leaving them crippled for life. To steal was to gamble not just with freedom, but with the very pieces of your body. But if the thief returned, if hunger or desperation drove him back again, the price was final. Hanging. The gallows became a familiar sight, its wooden beams creaking in the wind like the ribs of some skeletal giant. Ropes swung above the crowd, their nooses waiting. Men, women, even children were marched forward, their crimes read aloud. A loaf of bread, a coin snatched from a purse, a cloak taken from a merchant's stall. The sentence was always the same, the slow drop, the sudden jerk, the body left swaying for hours as a warning. The gallows became the great equalizer of Tudor justice. No matter how small the theft, no matter how desperate the need, repeat it and you would hang. Even those who did not steal were not safe. Begging itself could be death. Only the sick or disabled were allowed to beg in the streets, their suffering considered license to survive. But for the poor and able-bodied, hunger was not an excuse. It was treason against order. Caught with an outstretched hand, you might be accused of deceit, condemned as a fraud, and led to the scaffold. The rope was merciless. Men who had begged for pennies dangled above the crowd, their faces frozen in the grimace of death, their bodies twisting in the cold wind. For them, poverty was not only misery, but a death sentence. The laws were harsh because fear was the chosen weapon of the crown. Instead of relief, they offered terror. Instead of charity, cruelty. The poor became symbols, their punishment a warning that suffering was safer in silence than in the open. And so, the streets filled with the hungry, the broken, the mutilated, living reminders that in Tudor Britain, survival itself was a crime. They hanged people just for being poor. Here, you can support knowledge for free. If subscribing to Cave Tales Ancient History feels too costly, leave your excuse in the comments, because even the Tudors would find that bizarre. Justice in Tudor Britain did not end with the sentence of guilt. The courtroom itself could become a place of torment, and the prison beyond it a theater of cruelty where silence, defiance, or mere suspicion was enough to summon instruments of pain. You imagine the courtroom first. The air is thick with tension as a prisoner stands accused, but when the judge demands a plea, guilty or not guilty, the man refuses. Perhaps he fears losing his property, perhaps he hopes for mercy, or perhaps he simply chooses silence as his last act of defiance. But silence has no place in Tudor law. For those who would not speak, there was a punishment called peine forte et dure, the pressing. The condemned is laid flat upon the ground, his limbs spread wide. Heavy boards are lowered onto his chest, their rough edges scraping his skin. Then come the stones, one after another, placed upon the boards, each heavier than the last. His chest heaves, ribs splinter, breath comes ragged and short. Still, he refuses. More stones are piled, the weight crushing his body, forcing the life from his lungs until silence is broken not by his voice, but by death itself. In the Star Chamber, punishment was quieter, yet no less cruel. Here, the crimes were words: sedition, libel, defiance of authority. The sentences left their mark not only on the record, but on the body. An ear sliced from the head, leaving a jagged scar. A face branded with hot iron, the hiss of flesh burned into memory. Heavy fines drove families into ruin, chains of debt that bound as tightly as iron shackles. The Star Chamber reminded every subject that even a whisper against power could cost more than freedom. It could cost identity, reputation, livelihood. And then there was the Tower. Its grey stones rose above London, a fortress of fear. To be led through its gates was to step into a world designed not to kill swiftly, but to break slowly. In the dungeons below, shadows cling to the walls. Dampness seeps through stone, and silence is broken only by the groan of iron. Prisoners are stretched upon the rack, ropes tearing at their joints until bone grinds against bone, shoulders ripping from sockets. Others are suspended by manacles, wrists chained high above their heads, their bodies left to dangle until muscles tear and joints crack. The air smells of rust and blood, prayers whispered into the dark unanswered. Few left the tower with their bodies whole. Fewer still left with their minds intact. These punishments were not about guilt or innocence. They were about control, about forcing obedience where words failed. Silence itself was treated as rebellion. The Tudors crushed people under stones for staying silent. If you stay silent by not subscribing, at least break it with a comment explaining why. Punishment in Tudor Britain was never confined to dark chambers or hidden gallows. It lived in the open air, under the sun, where the whole of society was invited to watch. For the Tudors, justice was not only enforcement, it was performance. Every execution, every shaming, every mutilation became a stage where fear and obedience were burned into the hearts of all who gathered. You walk into a town square and find it transformed into a carnival of death. The scaffold rises like a stage, its wooden planks freshly swept, its beams heavy with rope. Vendors move among the crowd, selling pies and ale as though this were a fair. Children sit upon their fathers' shoulders, craning their necks for a better view. The condemned is brought forth, their crimes read aloud with ceremony, and then the spectacle begins. Cheers erupt as the rope tightens, as the axe falls, as the fire crackles. For the Tudors, this is not horror. This is lesson, celebration, and warning all in one. To the crowd, executions were festivals. A man's final breath became the climax of a day's entertainment. Drums beat in rhythm, trumpets sounded, and sometimes a ballad was even sung of the criminal's deeds. The children who laughed in the square today would grow into adults who remembered not only the crime, but the punishment. And that was precisely the point. The monarchy wanted memory itself to be forged in blood and fire, passed down from parent to child. A tale retold until it became instinct. Public humiliation worked in the same way. The stocks and pillory were not simply punishments, they were community gatherings. A thief with his head locked in wood became a target for every passerby to spit upon, to throw rotten fruit, to jeer until his spirit bent beneath the weight of ridicule. A drunk in his barrel costume became the day's joke, mocked by neighbors who would later retell the story at their hearths. Each act of punishment bound the community together in shared cruelty, a reminder that order was not only enforced from above, but policed by every hand that threw a stone, or every voice that shouted in scorn. Children were not shielded from these scenes. They were placed at the front, instructed to watch, to remember, to understand. A mother might cover her child's eyes at the moment of the axe, but the sound of the crowd, the smell of blood, the weight of silence before the cheer would linger forever. To the Tudors, fear was a gift passed down, a lesson too important to spare the young. Justice became ritual, a spectacle that fused law with theatre, death with entertainment. To live in Tudor Britain was to live in a world where cruelty was not hidden, but celebrated, where suffering was not a secret, but a bond uniting rulers and ruled. Punishment was never private. It was the heart of public life, the dark rhythm that beat beneath the festivals, the sermons, the marketplace itself. Some punishments in Tudor Britain were so rare, so grotesque, that they seemed to rise from the depths of nightmare rather than the order of law. These were not the everyday whippings, not the common hangings, but sentences reserved for moments when the crown wanted to make fear unforgettable. Poison was the crime that sparked one of the most terrifying punishments of all. In 1531, Henry VIII, gripped by paranoia, decreed that poisoners would be boiled alive. You stand in Smithfield, the great square where fire so often consumed heretics, and now you see a great iron cauldron set above roaring flames. Chains clink as a man is dragged forward, condemned for lacing another's cup. His body is thrust into the scalding water, and a scream rises so piercing it silences even the loudest jeers. The crowd leans forward as his skin blisters, as steam rises in choking clouds, as his flesh peels beneath the boiling surge. He is pulled up, gasping, then plunged again, the ritual repeated until life abandons him. The law called it justice. To the watching mob, it was terror bound in water and flame. And then there was witchcraft, an accusation that could fall upon anyone, but most often upon women who lived too strangely, too independently, or too outspokenly for their neighbor's liking. You see her dragged from her cottage, her cries drowned by shouts of "Witch!" If she floats when cast into the river, the water rejects her, proof of guilt. If she sinks, she is innocent, but drowned all the same. Others are tied to the stake, the brushwood piled high, the fire consuming their bodies as the crowd chants prayers. Sometimes the rope at the gallows is her fate, her body twisting in the air, while the world below declares victory over the devil. Witchcraft was not always proven. It did not need to be. Fear itself was evidence enough. Even those who committed no violent act could suffer punishments crafted to mark them forever. Forgers and fraudsters, men whose crimes were written in ink rather than blood, were branded. A hot iron was pressed against the flesh, searing the letter of their sin into skin. You can almost hear the hiss as the iron bites, smell the acrid smoke of burning flesh. The victim screams, but when the iron is lifted, the mark remains. A scar that speaks in silence, announcing their crime long after the sentence is carried out. Branding was not only pain, it was identity, transformed into a permanent confession, one that no cloak could hide. These strange punishments were rare, but their rarity made them all the more powerful. Each act was a spectacle crafted to sear itself into memory, to linger in whispers long after the flames died or the iron cooled. They showed that the Tudors had punishments not only for common crimes, but for uncommon fears, for poison that might slip unseen into a cup, for witchcraft that might haunt a household, for deceit that could corrode the trust of a kingdom. The smoke of Tudor punishments has long since cleared, the gallows torn down, the iron bridles rusted into dust. Yet their shadow stretches across centuries, lingering not only in history, but in the way we think about justice itself. When you look back at the punishments of that age, you cannot help but measure them against the world you know now. Today, a thief is fined, imprisoned, or rehabilitated. In Tudor Britain, his hand was taken, his life ended on a rope. Today, a woman may speak freely in court, in Parliament, in her home. In Tudor Britain, her tongue could be silenced by iron, her body plunged beneath river water. Today, religion is a matter of choice. In Tudor Britain, belief was dictated, and doubt was burned alive in the market square. The contrast is stark, a reminder that what we now call basic rights were once luxuries unknown. Were these punishments effective? Did they truly prevent crime? Or did they merely paint the streets with fear? The Tudors believed that pain and spectacle deterred rebellion. And yet theft continued, poverty persisted, dissent never vanished. Crime did not end, it only moved, reshaped by terror. But cruelty served another purpose, one perhaps greater than deterrence. It was propaganda. Every scaffold was a stage, every execution a sermon. When the Crown displayed a severed head on London Bridge, it was not only punishing one man, it was teaching thousands. When a woman in a scold's bridle stumbled through the streets, it was not only silencing her voice, it was reminding all others to guard their own. Punishment was as much about shaping obedience as it was about enforcing law. This dual role, justice as both enforcement and theater, defined the Tudor age. It created a society where people feared not only breaking the law, but also being seen breaking it. Guilt was not just a private burden, it was a public mark, carried in scars, in silence, in shame. Fear was the glue that bound the Tudor world together, and punishment was the hammer that drove it deep. Now, centuries later, the brutality of Tudor Britain feels almost unthinkable. And yet, beneath the surface of modern justice, echoes remain. The spectacle of punishment has changed form, but the instinct to use fear as a tool of order still lingers in human history. The Tudors remind us that cruelty is never only about the crime. It is about power and the way rulers carve obedience into the lives of their people. This is the legacy of Tudor justice, not merely punishment, but performance. Not simply law, but theater of control. A world where death, shame, and suffering were turned into instruments of rule. This is Cave Tales' ancient history. We keep the darkest truths of history alive. Subscribe so that silence does not bury them again. Or, if you choose silence, at least break it with a comment, because in Tudor Britain, silence itself was punished. The journey through Tudor Britain is not one easily forgotten. You have walked the crowded squares where traitors were torn apart before roaring crowds. You have stood by the stakes where heretics were swallowed by fire, their screams carried into the sky. You have seen women gagged by iron, dunked beneath black water, their dignity stolen as punishment for words too sharp or voices too loud. You have watched children watch death, learning obedience through terror. You have traced the marks of the branded, the mutilated, the maimed, scars that spoke louder than words. Each punishment was more than cruelty. It was language. A severed head on London Bridge was not simply flesh. It was a sentence, a proclamation to all who crossed the Thames that loyalty was life, disobedience was death. A man pressed to death for silence was not merely executed. He was made into a symbol that even refusing to speak was rebellion. A thief dangling on the gallows was not just one hungry soul punished. It was a warning that poverty itself could be criminal. In Tudor Britain, justice was not blind. It was deliberate, merciless, and designed to be remembered. What remains with you is not only the brutality, but the spectacle. Punishment was performance. Pain was public. Suffering was theater. The Tudors built a society where power was written not only in laws, but in the bodies of those who broke them. It was a kingdom ruled by fear, shaped by rituals of cruelty that turned every punishment into a lesson, and every lesson into a scar upon the soul of a nation. And yet, though centuries have passed, the memory of that world lingers. It lingers in the stones of the tower, in the blackened wood of forgotten scaffolds, in the stories whispered through time. It lingers because the Tudors wanted it to linger. They wanted every cry, every brand, every execution to echo beyond its moment, to remain alive in history. And it has. This is Cave Tales Ancient History. We keep the darkest truths of history alive. Don't let them fade. Subscribe, or at least tell us in the comments why you choose silence while the Tudors chose spectacle.